Hello everybody and welcome. It is Wednesday, 4 p.m. Central European Time, so it's webinar time. Our webinar sessions center around the topic of populism and is part of the Nova Migra, that is, Norms and Values in European Migration Crisis project funded by the EU. The Nova Migra project tackles a topical issue that has become prominent in recent years in political science: the question of the rise of populism, its connection with migration, and its effects on Western democracies. The accompanying 5-part webinar series covers the relationship of migration and populism from various levels of abstraction. So we'll go from the philosophical to the socio-political approaches. The presentations will be accompanied by slides summarizing the content of the presentation. The webinar, by nature, is an interactive platform, so please feel free to join the discussion through our chat feature. Your questions will be answered and your remarks discussed after the presentation. And if you have missed something or would like to listen to any of the presentations again, we'll be sending the recording of the webinars around soon. So let's get started. Last week, we heard Professor Sheik's excellent analysis of how the Hungarian government framed the migration discourse to incite xenophobia for popularity purposes. Today's webinar will look at the radicalization of demographic nationalism in the era of globalization through the example of Hungary. Our presenter today is Attila Melegh, who is a senior researcher at the Demographic Research Institute, Central Statistical Office, Budapest, and an associate professor at the Institute of Sociology and Social Policy of Corvinus University, Budapest. He is the recipient of several academic honors and awards and a distinguished author. Please welcome Attila Melegh and enjoy the webinar.
Welcome everybody, it's a great pleasure to welcome you through this connection, and I'm hoping that we are going to have a rather nice 1-hour event. In this, I'm going to talk about a rather complicated issue, and of course this issue is not going to be finished in 30 or 40 minutes, what I'm going to talk about. The whole talk is trying to link two things in a rather systematic manner. So what I would like to do is to explain the rise of anti-migrant populism, and then mainly in Eastern Europe, and I would like to give the global story behind, because most people misunderstand that. They think that the local story need to be explained only from local factors, and I'm not going to follow this during my talk. So, a couple of words about myself. I teach at Corvinus University of Budapest, and I'm also the founding director of Karl Polanyi Center for Global Social Studies. The first part of the discussion is going to be about some, let's put it this way, ideological developments. So I'm going to show some of the things, public opinion figures, which might show what it means to have an anti-migrant public opinion, or to have some kind of a harsh rejection of migrants. The first poster you can see was used by the government of Hungary during the last election campaign. And then in this poster or billboard, which was put into very remote villages of the country as well, it was very funny when you could see it in villages. And then it basically says, in beautiful Hungarian, the United Nations wants us to accept migrants continuously. Hungary decides, not the United Nations. This means this is a very extreme form of stating some claim for sovereignty concerning migration, which means the United Nations has nothing to say about migration, only Hungary decides in that. The next which I would like to show you is the European Parliament elections last year. This was May 26 in 2019. And then you can see in this map, you can see which of the countries actually had such strong parties or strong political support for anti-migrant agendas. And then you can see there is the United Kingdom. This agenda was so important that they continued the Brexit. There is, of course, the story of the French far right, Marine Le Pen and France. There was also a huge advancement on behalf of Matteo Salvini in Italy. And then Poland, very importantly. We rarely talk about this, but the Czech public opinion is very close to the most notable example, my own country, Hungary. And then you can see that in case you would compare this to previous periods, there is a strong advancement of this right wing. And then we will clarify whether we talk about populism or nationalism. Now, the next, it's a complicated graph, or it's a complicated slide, what you can see now on your screen. And then this is about what happened to the public opinion in terms of anti-migrant feelings during a period which is, of course, contested whether we call it globalization or a specific period of global capitalism. I think in a neutral sense, we can use the term now globalization. And then it actually explains, or it tries to sum up the changes up till the refugee crisis, or something of an event called the refugee crisis in 2015. And that is the World Value Survey. So what you can see here, the World Value Survey started in the 1980s. And then this shows in a comparative way which countries had a public opinion which became more negative concerning migrants. The question they used, you can see it on the slide. Could you please mention any that you would not like to have as a neighbor? And immigrant and foreign worker, this was the answer they gave. So that you see a couple of countries on the left side, which had an increasing rejection of immigrants or foreign workers. And then on the right side, you see where there was no increase, or even there could be some decrease. And actually, in case we look at this, we get to rather interesting conclusions. Let's look at the increasing ones. Of course, there are the quote-unquote natural culprits, the ones which we expected. Many of the Western countries which experienced a relatively rising immigration. So you see Australia, Germany is actually a little bit dubious, but there was an increase. Very importantly, Japan, very importantly, South Korea, Netherlands, New Zealand, Spain, and the United States. These were the countries where there was an increasing level of rejection. Beside that, we can also see in a comparative way, we can see that countries like Algeria, India, South Africa, and Turkey also had such a change. Now, what is interesting here is, of course, in case you look at, let's say, India and Turkey, that there was a rather dramatic shift toward neoliberal policies. And then in that sense, we should not be too much surprised. Now, very interestingly, the other group of country, they are coming from the former socialist bloc. So you can see Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Russia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and Hungary. And this is actually which proves the point. It proves the point that we need to talk about this rise of anti-migrant feelings in Eastern Europe, because you can see it from the figures. It's actually one of the group of the countries which is doing this. Not increasing or some decrease, that's also very interesting. I would like to just mention two things here because, time is running and I don't want to take too much time for this. One is that there are some East European countries which, regardless of the political campaigns they are experiencing, the public attitude is actually not worsening in this respect. It's not changing in this direction. Poland, Slovenia, and Romania. We can come back to this, but I think here in these countries like Poland and Romania, one of the most important things that they receive, up till that point, they received relatively little immigration, while they provided a lot of out migrants. Also, very importantly, you see quite a lot of Latin American countries. This is before 2015. I would like to stress it, because even Latin America is changing now, and it is joining these anti-migrant feelings nowadays, exactly. So just to show you how it was. One more thing which I would like to draw your attention to, namely that they also some kind of a vague correlation between the rise of anti-migrant feelings and the, let's put it this way, more authoritarian rule. And then you can see this more authoritarian rule can be also identified with these processes. Now let's continue our story. Let's come to Europe in this respect, which is going to be interesting. Here you can see up to 2018, the Eurobarometer, and then you can see that around 2015, all of a sudden, immigration became a prime concern when people were asked about which was the main concern concerning Europe. Not their own country, but the whole European Union, and that was the answer. Beyond immigration, there, of course, terrorism, which made a huge advancement. And then you can see that this is qualitatively different from the previous period. In the previous period, the economic situation was the prime concern, and this prime concern declined dramatically, and then this took over. I think this is not accidental, and we would not say that this is just a mistake. Now let's continue. In case we look at the same figures, namely that what is the main concern when the own country is asked? That is to say, when they are not talking about Europe, but they are talking about their own country. Let's say when Hungarian respondents have to say what they think is the most important for them, then you can see two things actually making huge advancement. You see unemployment, in some countries immigration truly, but very importantly there is health and social security issues which are also climbing up when the own country is mentioned. I think these are not contradictory things to analyze, but these are things which are to be analyzed in a parallel. So we should link these things. Now, how to do a dynamic historical analysis, and then I don't want to bore anybody with my complicated chart. The only thing I would like to say that very often, many of the critiques from various sides, it can be, critiques from a liberal point of view or critiques from the far right point of view. When they're looking at processes, they make one big mistake, namely that they are not doing a proper dynamic analysis, which is based on some kind of a historical materialism, meaning that we have a history of discourses and ideas in an interaction with material structures and material processes. And these are the things which are making changes and leading to various historical possibilities or terrains. So the only thing I'm trying to say is that whenever we see a massive change in cognitive structures, then we also have to look at the material processes, or when we are seeing massive changes in material processes, then we should look at the ideological part of the story as well. And then this is what I'm trying to do in a vague manner in this discussion as well. Now, let's talk about some of the concepts I'm using here. Are we talking about, in the case of Eastern Europe, are we talking about some kind of a demographic nationalism, or we are talking about populism? There's a huge debate. A lot of people don't like the term populism, and I see the reasons why. I think the most important thing to understand, in case we can go through this concept, is that demographic nationalism is a good term in the sense that it combines two elements. It combines the idea, a kind of a biopolitical idea, very much dominant in Eastern Europe, namely that we should have any kind of a demographic growth and any kind of a demographic solution on the basis of so-called own resources, right? That is to say, we don't need massive migration, we need higher fertility, better mortality, and we should actually attract people coming home. In that sense, demographic nationalism is an absolutely correct and useful concept to use, right? Demographic nationalism is also an appropriate concept for us because it also refers to a long historical fear of East European small language countries. Because Eastern Europe is very peculiar in the sense that here we have quite a lot of nation states which are rather small, and they have a rather small language community. So we are talking about a language which is spoken by millions of people. Now this nationalism has been always afraid of losing ground, of disappearing. So during the period of capitalism, nationalism has always been talking about there is a chance. And of course, it's a very important thing immediately to understand why anti-migrant feelings could come up here so massively, because this kind of a historical memory or this kind of a historical memory narrative has been extremely vital. Why populism? And that's actually a good question, and I don't want to go into debate. Populism, I mean, is some kind of, especially radical populism, is some kind of a radical promise to change certain processes without changing structural elements. That is to say, they come and say, as in all different ways, I'm going to reduce poverty without changing the economic institutions, which of course is very problematic, because how you can change the levels of poverty without that. And the same thing is with migration. In case somebody would like to reduce migration, then you have to change basic institutions of capitalism, which are uprooting people continuously and which are able to push up migration dramatically. So this is what I mean by populism, and this is why I'm happy to accept that. Although I'm happy to go into discussions whether it's a useful term or not. So I'm joining these things. I'm talking about demographic nationalism, and I am talking about very populistic discourses which are saying I can raise fertility without changing the labor market, or I can change, migration without changing the basic social structure. Okay, now in case we continue, there's one more element, and here I would like to quote a very famous Hungarian political thinker, Karl Polanyi, who wrote that fantastic book in 1944, which was called The Great Transformation. Karl Polanyi drew our attention to one very important connection. He argued very early that in case countries opt for radical market fundamentalism, then immediately there is a social double movement. That is to say, when there is a sense that market is taking too much power over society, then there is a reaction on behalf of society against it. Now, in that sense, nationalism can be, and once again, I'm not qualifying, can be seen as some kind of a double movement. And here is a quote actually from Karl Polanyi, which when I found, I laughed a lot. In 1945, he wrote the following, in a very good book. Actually, the title of that essay is extremely revealing. He argued universal capitalism or regional planning. That was the title of the piece. And then he argued in that if the Atlantic Charter really committed us, meaning Eastern Europe, to restore free markets where they have disappeared, we might thereby opening the door to the reintroduction of crazy nationalism into regions from which it has disappeared. And then I think it's very important. But we know this connection. And we also know that this connection has been seen some other people like Gramsci as well. But we don't know the exact mechanisms. Let me contribute to some of the mechanisms here in order to better understand this. Now, what are the material structural factors behind this kind of move toward this anti-migrant nationalism? not just in Eastern Europe, but very importantly now in the East European case. And now I would like to, before I go into these things, I show you a graph. Please take a look at this graph. Unfortunately, the format has been a little bit changed, which means that the arrows are not matching exactly the thing, but I'm very happy to explain to you what color means what, right? So the most important thing is that, and let me just check my notes as well, not to make a mistake, right? Is that the green one is the green line, in case you look at it, shows the increase of population as compared to 1960, right, up till 1990. Then you can see this is what we can consider as a previous period up till a new era opening up in the late 1980s, early 1990s. You can see that the population growth was steady, and then there was an increase of human population more than 60 percentage points. During the same time, very importantly, fertility was declining, and then the decline of fertility was very steady. In case you look at mortality, which is, the two, how can I don't know whether you can see any kind of a mouse here, but you don't see any kind of a mouse. This kind of two lines which start increasing a little bit, then it stops, and then it just increasing a little bit. So in the 1960s, we had a dramatic improvement of mortality. Now, what is important to us is the following, that from the period of 1980, the increase of migrant stock, that is to say, the number of people globally who were born in a different country in which they lived, right, as a different country, then it started increasing rapidly, and actually by 1990, it caught up with population growth. Now let's look at the next period, when we are seeing some kind of a push of market fundamentalism up till the 2000s, and then you can see the following thing. Population growth has continued, although we can see that very recently population growth is actually losing momentum as compared to previous parts. Then you can also see that fertility declined further, but actually this relative decline is actually getting lower and lower, which is also due to historical factors because so much has been achieved in earlier times. The very important thing for us in this whole story is look at the blue line, is the global stock of migrants, and then you can see that actually the increase of the global migrant stock was far bigger from the 2000s, from the 1990s, and actually took over that. So population growth, and all these elements are important. Now let us go back to our summary of material structure factors. The intensity of migration is going up when fertility is going down, and very importantly, this is what I would like to draw your attention to, aging is going up. The most important thing behind aging is not mortality improvement, it's always the decline of fertility. So aging is going up, and very importantly, and this is we know from studies from my colleague of József Böröc as well, the state redistribution in this period is not changing. So we see a demographic change, very importantly, a dramatic change in Europe, and most importantly, in Eastern Europe. And then this level of state redistribution, which could counterbalance some of the problems in this change of demographic composition, is not changing. The next thing which we have to look at another graph, and I just show it to you very quickly because it's a beautiful graph. It's full of colors. Everybody loves it, but it's difficult to figure out what it is about. This is my Viennese colleagues did this in the Demographic Research Institute there. This is the so-called Wittgenstein method. Namely, we can estimate the migration flows, and these streams of colors means from what region into what region migration flows are going, and then how wide the stream is shows how intensive the whole story. The only thing I would like to show you at the moment is the following. This is 1995. You can see that the most important migratory flows are within continents. So you can see within America, Latin America, North America, or you can see South Asia, and within Asia, Africa, within Africa. While actually it's very funny, in case you look at this, Europeans are always complaining about too much migration, and you can see that Europeans are actually, relatively speaking, they are not taking too intensively, don't participate in this story. Now let's look at the latest, because we don't know the beyond, we cannot go in data. This is the 2005 and 2010. And then I would like to draw your attention to the thing that this map has become much more interwoven. We have much stronger streams among continents. Why I'm drawing this to your attention is exactly the reason that the previous historical migratory routes have been extended into new routes. One thing which I can show to you, for instance, is that, let's say, migrants from Western Asia going into Europe started going up. And then you can see, let's say, Latin America-Europe connection has also increased, rather importantly, which means, and this is an absolutely important factor, in case certain populations, especially certain populations having a certain ideological construct in their head, when they see new groups of migrants emerging, of course, the panic and the fear can go up. So in case we go back to the things, then we can see that new routes have been coming up, and then these new routes can be of more rejection. Now, one more thing which is very important is the next point, and I'm hoping that I'm not. I think I'm maintaining my time limits. My colleagues are looking at me and they are not trying to threaten me, which I'm very glad to see, is the following point. We know it since the 1980s. Saskia Sassen started working on this very importantly, namely that when foreign direct investment goes up, let's say between United States and the Philippines, or in whichever direction. So the increase of FDI relative to GDP means, a change in economic regime in a lot of ways, but very importantly, it leads to an increased out migration. This is not a logic which is so easy to understand, but I think the logic is very important. Meaning, in case foreign direct investment increases, it has certain structural preconditions. When can foreign direct investment increase? When the so-called, as they put it in a nice way, business atmosphere improves for global capital, meaning these economies become more open in this respect, which means that they finish providing extra money for local industry, they finish import controls, so free trade is going up, and so on and so on. So the related economic policies. Why is it important? It's important because if FDI cycle goes up, then more and more people become uprooted in the target countries because of the change of the economic policy, because of market fundamentalism, as Polanyi would have said it, because of more and more disembeddedness. This is absolutely relevant with regard to Eastern Europe. For Eastern Europe, the change in this respect was dramatic. In order to have more foreign direct investment, basically they finished a very embedded system called socialism. And as soon as they finished socialism, there was a shock therapy of losing jobs. I just give you one figure of my own country, which not many people swallow, but in the early 1990s, and actually up till very recently, Hungary lost 1.5 million jobs compared to previous periods. I think there's no need to explain why that is so important, when we are talking. And I could have shown you the figures, but due to time limits, I'm not going to do the figures, how migration flows have been changing, and how there has been rather important cycles in this. What we can see at the moment is actually that this kind of FDI cycle, this is getting to its end, and which means that most probably this is one of the reasons why we are having a new political regime emerging. Now, one more thing I would like to draw your attention to, and that is also very important in explaining why certain anti-migrant feelings could come up, is that globally speaking, in case we look at the changes, we can see that more and more countries are integrated into migration, into global migration. Most importantly, most countries are sending migrants. Nonetheless, the countries on the basis of net migrations, which are net immigrant countries, this number has not changed, which means that there is some kind of a bottleneck syndrome. And here are something, I hope that I have it here on the graphs, but I wanted to show you something. I think, I saved it from you, so I just need to explain. In that respect, in bottleneck syndrome, Europe is very special, because in case you compare it with global levels, then the migration intensity indices for Europe were already in 1990, were well above the global average, and it increased even more dramatically than in other regions. So in 1990, the total number of people born in another country relative to the local population was around 6%, while the global average was around 3%. Now that increased to 11 or even beyond 11% by now, which means that this bottleneck syndrome, that is to say that immigration became an issue in Europe, is actually, I think we can see. Now, one more very important thing. There is an increase. So what do we see? We see an aging population. In Europe, it's dramatically aging. Aging is dramatic in Eastern Europe as well, right? What does it mean in terms of labor market competition? Now, it means several things. One is that very importantly, there's an increasing need for migrants. In this period, we could see, as I argued earlier, welfare benefits relatively did not improve. So there has been an attack on the welfare systems. The most dramatic could be in Eastern Europe, right? Out of a complete social security, we got into a very large-scale social insecurity. When there is an aging, then migration can be a very important quote-unquote solution, because taking care of the elderly population, the sick population, can be handled via importing cheap labor. So there is a direct link here. The other thing, which is very interesting, is that, and we could see it in previous economic historical period of time, when there was a restructuring of the global economy, is that this wage competition has also is also changing. In case I am interpreting the figures well, then I see that, relatively speaking, wages in European countries, in some ways also in East European countries, are at least up till the so-called refugee crisis, were relatively stagnating, while where large-scale investment went to many of the upcoming economies, including China, these wages relatively in certain sectors were going up. Now this means that Europe is, while losing global economic control, going into a more demographically fragile situation. At the same time, it is seeing an increasing labor competition in terms of wages. So some of the wage privileges are actually being lost. In some ways, we can say that even European working classes were enjoying such a security which the other parts did not know. Then they actually enjoyed such wages what the others did not enjoy. And then they see that this whole situation is changing, which can be one of the reasons why there is a rise. Now, let me go back to one more thing. And that I think is important to explain, because there has been rather misleading things concerning explaining the relative change in terms of asylum seekers. So I wanted to put this together for you. I was working with my colleagues on this rather hard. You may think that globally we know and it's easy to calculate how many refugees and asylum seekers we have. And I can tell you that the situation, at least up to the very recent periods, is not so easy how to make this. So here is a time series which I put together. And there you can see actually that in case you look at the flow of refugees to the European Union, 28 countries, then you can see that there was a big wave of incoming asylum seekers in the early 1990s, right? Now, very importantly, in case you look at this figure at that time, it was really a very high peak, especially in case you look at it in terms of population intensity. There you can see which was the region which was producing this high peak of asylum seekers. And there you can see at that time it was Eastern Europe, right? Including Yugoslavia and Albania. These regions produced this massive inflow of asylum seekers. We tend to forget this. In case you look at the very recent one, you can see one thing which is very important, is that the relative figures, the relative inflow as compared to previous periods, it's rather dramatic. Plus, very importantly, Asia, most importantly, Western Asia and Central Asia became super important. So this is when we talk about Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and then, of course, some other countries. Very interestingly, there's a lot of talk in public discourses about Africa. The relative ratio of Africa is actually not changing in this respect. And then up till recently, in case you look at the figures, Africa and Eastern Europe has been playing a similar role. You might interpret this actually that this is one of the reasons why East Europeans are struggling for having some less competition from others, right? And then, okay, this I explained. This I'm not going to into as well, right? And then let me sum up the European part, and I think very soon we are coming to the end of our talk. And let me please provide me silently another 4 or 5 minutes, right? And then we finish, and then you can ask your questions and comments, and we can start the discussion. So, European level historical material factors. Low and declining fertility, much lower than anywhere else in the world. Also, very importantly, Europe, most importantly Eastern Europe, has lost some demographic privileges in terms of mortality. That is to say, from the 1980s, the mortality of non-European areas has improved relatively much better than here, right? Then, very importantly, increased labor and wage competition, very importantly concerning China. And then also, there's one more thing. Europe has changed its labor market in 2 ways. One is that, and actually, in case you look at, let me put in this way, right-wing voters, which are generally not so educated male voters, they can be also very, because the labor market in Europe has changed. In terms of gender equity, Europe has achieved some kind of an unprecedented equal level of labor force participation rate for men and women. Once again, it's a paradox. Here it is happening, but it might have a political backlash for those who are cherishing quote-unquote more conservative far-right values. Also, very importantly, the share of labor in economic wealth has been declining. This is also, it's not just a European phenomenon, but here it's actually dramatic. In case you calculate very simply the ratio between wage and GDP, then you can see that most important in Eastern Europe, the role of value, the role of labor in this has declined dramatically. One more thing which is also very important, and I hope I have the graph for you. Here it is. Europe is worried because of two things as well, in case they are thinking in a competitive ways. Europe, including Eastern Europe, controlled more than 55% of the total GDP in the 1960s. And now it is actually reaching 30%, right? In case you look at the relative population weight, then it's from 20%, it declined basically to 10%. It's a shrinking, globally less and less significant continent, which is losing control, but don't losing privileges. It's a super privileged population, which is of course afraid of losing some of these privileges. I think this is a very important thing. And then, just to show one more thing, I would like to show you one more graph, which for me it was extremely revealing. Actually, when I calculated not just the economic weight, not just the population weight of the continent, but I also calculated the migration weight. What is the ratio of migrants living in Europe out of the global stock? And then it is 30%. So up till now, the economic weight was higher than the migration weight, meaning theoretically there was more economic opportunity than in terms of, what was relative to migration. And now these weights are crossing each other. So here we have a extremely privileged population, which is experiencing an increase in migration intensity, which experiences the loss of global control, but the maintenance of privileges and the demographic composition, which is all pushing toward more welfare competition for services, competition in the labor market. I think as a sociologist, I am not surprised at all that anti-migrant feelings are really going up. And most importantly, I'm not surprised that in this kind of a game, Eastern Europe plays a primary goal. So altogether, now I'm finishing and concluding, is that I think we see, as a kind of a counter movement, this rise of nationalism, this talk about regaining control gains a momentum. Although I would like to say, in my view, of course, this counter movement is definitely not a solution for these problems. I think it's more of a new management of a previous period of capitalism. There is a very worrying sign here because, in history, nothing disappears. It's like the energy law. Nothing disappears, meaning that this kind of a talk of national revitalization, this kind of propaganda against migrants, propaganda for the national revitalization, which we all know, and kind of a talk of racial suicide, and so it's not going to disappear. Karl Polanyi made it very clear in his writings very early on when he analyzed this, that these were key momentums in the rise of authoritarian fascism between the two world wars. What we can see here is complex historical dynamics, material cognitive interplay on all levels. So what we are seeing is not just a propaganda and not just a political mistake, unfortunately. And very importantly, the working classes are truly receptive. So altogether, in case we put these things together, we have to think about whether this outcome, how we can actually evaluate. And then, to be honest, for me as a critical sociologist, one very important concept of forced consciousness came out, meaning forced consciousness means that it is a reaction to the changes which have been going on, but it is not showing a way out of the tensions and the problems we had. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. It was very interesting, and I gather that it's a complex issue and a lot of figures and issues to look at. I encourage the audience to put questions, and here we have one question now. This one is by Esbeta. Thank you for a great talk. Do you think that if the demographic composition of refugee and migrants wanting to come to Europe was different, the anti-immigrant sentiments would be not as strong or non-existent? Great question. Please answer.
Thank you very much for the question, Esbeta Gociak. It's an extremely important question, and I think, of course, we can't answer questions what if, because we can only analyze mainly what we have. But I think in some ways, these anti-migrant feelings are not about migrants themselves and their composition. In one sense, yes, new groups have appeared. And then if new groups appear, then I think the level of rejection can go up rather easily. On the other hand, I think these European countries are very much preoccupied with themselves. So basically, I think this anxiety concerning uprooting, concerning too much of the market fundamentalism, increased anxiety, and this anxiety can be satisfied with all kinds of things. I just want to go into the saying that this dramatic increase of fake news, this dramatic increase of fear mongering, fear talk in the social media and everywhere, I think is an answer. And then, of course, most of the statements, I think we all suffer when we read these things. What a nonsense can gain reputation nowadays. I hope it's an answer to your question. If not, let me know, and then we come back to this later.
Thank you very much for this answer. I encourage the audience to put more questions, remarks. But if I may ask you something, Professor Melegh, by thanking you very much for this excellent lecture. In 2 weeks' time, we are going to have an international conference on populism and migration in Budapest, and you, luckily, are one of the speakers. Could you please show us just a little bit what will be the topic that you are going to talk about?
So I think I'm going to continue this saga, this story. One thing that I've already hinted some of the points, namely that Eastern Europe has been changing its mode of integration into global capitalism dramatically. And it is very specific. And to be honest, the shock for the East European population has been far bigger than many other parts. I'm not saying that other parts are not suffering or there are no problems. This is very far from me. But the point is the following, that there are some local factors which also play a role. And let me just sum it up quickly, right? What are the key things? First, demographic nationalism, some kind of a feeling that we need to protect ourselves and, from disappearing, is an institutionalized government policy. Not in the just now, but for a long historical period of time. Namely, from the 1960s, under the socialist period, the government started developing pro-natalist policies, dramatically secure social services in order to achieve higher demographic reproduction encouraging marriage, encouraging childbearing, and so on. Now, a lot of people criticize this in all different grounds. I'm sure people can have different values. But as a sociologist, I would just take one very important point. In these dramatic changes, most of the social services, at least the quality of them, declined dramatically. Health service, there are bigger and bigger populations having no access to proper health service. There is a labor insecurity. Labor security was dramatically good, labor insecurity now. In this period, one thing has remained more or less stable, namely this child benefit and family allowances, family support, and this new government of Orban after 2010 played it out very continuously. And then you see it's easy to understand people because they incorporate that into their household budget. And it gives them some kind of a social security, which means that they get, extra help for, let's say, buying houses. Previously, it was always a big problem how to buy things. And now the government is providing them money. So in that sense, I think that it's over-evaluated. This is one thing. And then there are also very important local political factors, which have some global connotations, but I think we cannot mix that. What is that? For a long time, after the change, let me put it in this way, there was a consensus in the Hungarian elite concerning market fundamentalism. They were saying that we had to just suffer because market is going to take care of things, and then when people join the European, or the countries join the European Union, which is a free market bloc, then it's going to be absolutely okay. And then whole political elites have been doing this. But in the meantime, labor market figures, social statistics showed extremely varying things. They had no idea what to do. It was just a question of time when certain political groups understand this and they start sending different messages. With this, I'm not saying that now the situation is absolutely different. The only thing I'm saying is that the political language has changed. And number three, the political communication and the internal fight of elites. So what I would like to draw your attention to in this dramatic change in Eastern Europe is that some of the business groups and elite groups which could not make advance previously, now with the rise of nationalism, now with the rise of talking about security, symbolically defending the nation, they use this language in order to capture the state and then to reshuffle certain investments, certain money in order to go ahead. And then for this, they were looking for a new economic model. This, I think, are very important local factors in the whole story, but this, I would not say that it is a completely just a global story.
Thank you very much. I gather that there's another question. This question is by János Solomon. I would like to see it. All right, here it is on the screen. So, no, this is not the one. 5 weeks ago, we had an interesting webinar by János Solomon, and now he was listening to you, and he puts this question. In your talk, you have described the dramatic process taking place in Europe. What structural changes, if any, are needed to deal with these varying processes? You refer to the rise of national populism as a reaction to these processes. What about the possible rise of socialist populism? Interesting question.
It's a very interesting, a very important question. And actually, we can start a long discussion on this. But let me put it this way. Let me translate the question in the following way. We see basically two political reactions to the changing processes. One is the quote-unquote liberal position in this. The liberal position is arguing that we need to go toward the global labor market. We need to secure problems of social security and demographic composition through this. this is rejected by many within Europe. And I see that there is a dramatic problem here, which I mentioned. This market fundamentalism is very problematic and has caused a lot of trouble. Then we see this conservative, semi-authoritarian, nationalistic reaction to the whole story, which is a reaction actually to the previous position in a lot of ways. And then it says we need more state control, sovereignty, direct intervention in these things. Both are talking about all these things without asking the most important questions. Don't we need to change some of the key economic institutions we are living in? It might be that this migration tension is a warning that we need to change models radically. Why is it good to see that different social groups are fighting each other dramatically in a biopolitical game? And they are actually getting into some kind of hate speech, hate atmosphere with each other because of the perceived level of competition. I think, in case my reading is okay, we need tertium datur, meaning we need to change some of these quote-unquote market solutions to other ones which provide more stability for the masses of the different countries, not just the elites, not just certain middle-class groups, but at lower levels. I think this is very important because I think this is the reason why anti-migrant attitudes could go up during when market fundamentalism made great advancement. So I think that, and this actually gives an answer to the other question, is it possible socialist populism? We could see such populism. I remember in my country in 2002, the incoming prime minister, without any foundation, started to say, oh, I will take care of the wage levels. And then he did this without changing the structural conditions for that, meaning that very soon the country got into very serious political trouble. So we could see that. So in case I understand populism as, some radical promises, directly trying to handle questions without changing structural conditions, then we have already seen this. I think what we need is not populism. We need serious discussions how to change economic key economic institutions, and then to achieve a much better collective rationality.
Thank you very much for this answer. And this, looking also at the time, I'm afraid ends up not this webinar, but also the 5-part webinar series of ours. Many thanks to all of our presenters of this webinar series. Many thanks to you, Professor Melegh, for this wonderful lecture, and many thanks to the audience for active participation and attention. For now,
thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, although I could not listen to you. You had to listen to me. Next time I should listen to you. Thank you very much.
Sure, and we all are going to meet in 2 weeks' time at the Budapest conference. Some of the audience will attend that conference. Looking forward to hearing your talk at that conference. And for now, from all of us here at the Budapest Objective Studio, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.